immigration policy and law was bound to a history that understood the phenomenon of immigration in very problematic ways. In our history of immigration law in Canada, we have these notions of undesirability that were written into the law. In our 1906 Immigration Act, we first made deportations kind of legal for the first time. In the 1910 Act, they talked about prohibited classes. They all sort of drew on a dominant kind of thinking at the time, which was eugenic thinking. And they developed our policy and law to restrict immigration for fears that immigrants would bring some sort of hereditary lack that would contaminate the Canadian population. So these kinds of pieces of history are very important to how we understand how these systems operate, how the mental health systems operate, how the immigration systems operate, how our criminal justice systems operate. And there were advocates for this kind of thinking. Major figures in healthcare, Charles Clark, who was, some people argue, was one of Canada's most famous psychiatrists, advocated for the restriction on how immigrants could access public services and charities. Other figures like Helen McMurtry, who was a very dominant figure in child and maternal health in Canada, advocated for sterilization of people, immigration restrictions, and restrictions that really regulated marriages so that people wouldn't reproduce undesirables, including immigrants. Even Tommy Douglas, the father of universal healthcare in Canada, did his master's thesis around people who belong to a lower socioeconomic status, who are involved in what we would now call sex trade work, by nature a threat because they would be costly and burdensome to the healthcare system. The dominant story, the one of settlement, of European settlers who came to Canada and were charitable and welcoming to others and helped kind of develop and cultivate and civilize and produce. That dominant narrative happens on top of this other narrative that suppresses histories of the genocide and subjugation of Indigenous peoples who were rounded up and put on reserves. The history of Japanese internments during the war. There's a history of Chinese head taxes and the rejection of the Komagatu Maru, a boat that had a number of South Asian Sikh immigrants. These kinds of pieces of history that are taken for granted or often left out. One history is told on top of the other. And when this happens, you both produce those worthy of being exploited and those worthy of being excluded and those worthy sort of undesirability, while preserving a history that says Canada is just and inclusive and equitable and welcoming. So both of these things are happening simultaneously, where the dominant discourse in society helps Canada understand itself as charitable and welcoming, but the experiences are attached to this kind of undercurrent of history that tells a different aspect connected to oppression and violence. There were always two stories happening, and that one story was damaging to the other. So the reason to preserve these stories are that they serve a number of social, political, and historical purposes. So there's this constant storytelling around the need for immigrants and the valuing of immigrants within a story that remakes Canada as welcoming and safe and supportive. But that only exists because of the suppression of these other stories. To rationalize both the need to bring people in, to attract people, and to be able to exploit them at the same time. That there doesn't have to be this dominant telling of history that we are sort of this sanitized nation-building project that is divorced from this other history of colonization and exploitation and racism and eugenics. That the truth lies within our understanding of how all of these things happen. And that's attached to race, and it's attached to ability, and it's attached to ideas that we have around mental health and wellness.